Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here to speak with you about building dynamic teams, and specifically, how do we deal with the aftershocks when our teams change? Because it's inevitable that our teams are going to change, so we should prepare for it. My name is Heidi Helfand. I'm VP of Engineering at Kin Insurance, and I'm also author of the book Dynamic Reteaming. And so let's get started. So I'm a practitioner. I've been in the software industry more than 20 years. I work with teams. I currently lead a variety of teams, and I always read books to try to get better at what I do. And this is the sort of wisdom that I've read for years, like this book from Richard Hackman. It's a wonderful book about teams. And there's an assertion in there that implies that teams with stable membership perform better. So the goal that I've read for years is keep teams the same, keep them stable. That's the goal, as opposed to leaning into change. And one thing that I do know is that the reality is when you add someone new to a team, your team system is different. Your team changes. So people that join our companies and our teams bring with them their differences, their changes, their differences in perspective, their personalities. So when you only add as little as one person to a team system, that team system is different. And it's kind of interesting because since people are unique and they bring their personalities and character traits to the companies, people might arrive at your company and do things that are maybe outside the job description. Like my friend Paul here, when he joined our startup, this was the second startup that I was a part of, he inhabited his role of agile coach a bit differently than others. At one point, I snapped this photo when Paul was facilitating a very large event with people, and to get their attention, he stood on the table. Now, no one had quite done that before in our context. And I think it really illustrates that point of we inhabit our roles differently. This was not in the job description to stand on a table during the course of work. So in a similar vein, when one person leaves a team system, that remaining team is also different. So the things that leave could be related to the personality, the character is gone. The person that was doing something unique perhaps is not there anymore unless you deliberately try to carry it on. When more and more people leave a team, sometimes the team changes its identity. I've seen teams rename themselves after a big change in composition. It just feels different when people leave our teams and when people join our teams. And so looking back to that wisdom I would read, there's a lot of books behind me. I read books to solve problems that I encounter in the field. And for a while there, I thought, wait a minute, my career has spanned multiple different startups that you'll see in a moment, but I was thinking to myself, I've had all these successful companies in 20 years. We're not doing it wrong. And I think managing the changes in team composition and looking there is really helpful. So, in my career, I've been part of several companies that started as startups and then grew. At the first startup here, Expert City, we actually wound up building products called GoToMeeting and GoToWebinar, a very successful company that was acquired a couple of times. And I was the 15th employee there, starting on a web development team. And as more and more people joined our company, the organizational structure morphed and changed. Second startup I was at, called Appfolio, I was the 10th employee. And this one deliberately changed a lot more, even to share information specifically across different teams. So when your company grows from 10 people, that first startup team, to 600, can you imagine all the different kind of alterations in the organizational structure? The third company I joined a little later, 800th person at Procore Technologies, global company, and left when there were 1,300. Now I'm at Kin Insurance, which is a little bit smaller, around 425-ish people now, but I joined at 300. And at these different stages of the company, the changes looked a bit different. So I'm not saying that the best teams are the ones that change a lot, or that you should break up your teams tomorrow or start a reorg. I'm not insisting that you do that. I'm also not suggesting in this talk that you switch people around your teams frequently. And I'm not suggesting that you switch people's teams for no reason whatsoever. I'm also saying that it's not easy to do this. It's not easy to manage organizational change and growth or decline. What I am saying, though, is it's reality that our teams are going to change. So instead of looking at the lens of stability, let's look at the lens of anticipating and dealing with change, strengthening our organizational structures so that they can withstand the addition of people, the leaving of people, or any other surprises that may come our way. Because that's what happens in life. Sometimes you get surprised. So is your organizational structure built in such a way that it can move and sway with changes? Or is it so brittle that it's going to crumble if you have 10 people join or 20 people leave? So we want to build these organizational structures so that they can withstand this movement. That's the reality of it. And it happens in different ways. So I think, and I think it's helpful to look at some photos from nature. So there's one way that you start changes, and there's other ways that you get surprised and you have to deal with changes that come your way. So looking at the left side of this slide here is a photo of trees. These are avocado trees that were deliberately cut down to try to restart their growth. So it's a deliberate change, kind of like if leaders in an organization try to move people from one team to the next. It's a change that happens because someone catalyzed it deliberately. You could say the same for the wildfire on the right, but more likely a spark happens and then many people are surprised by this event and we have to deal with it. And I think very much like the nature of growth of our organizations, decline of our organizations, sometimes we start it and sometimes it happens and we need to move forward and deal with it. So we should expect both kind of situations. So I became curious about this topic of team change, not only from my experience I've told you about working in the software industry for 20 years, but I became very curious about this concept because I just kind of heard over and over that what we want to do is keep our team stable, forming, norming, storming, performing, adjourning. This Tuckman's model, for example, implies that we have these long-lived teams that really don't change. I became curious about that and I interviewed people around the world, coded the data for themes, and wrote this book, Dynamic Reteaming. This is the second edition. And I learned from this data that I collected and that I analyzed that there's certain reasons why our teams change and there's certain patterns that explain how the teams change. So the book goes into this. So I'll explain a little bit about this, which sets us up for the rest of the talk. So why are your teams going to change? It's like pretty predictable. Companies grow, companies shrink, right? Sometimes we want to start new products and it's helpful to have a different team work on a new product than maybe the existing team, or you take some members of an existing team and start a team off to the side. Maybe a priority changes and people are invited to work on something different than before. There's stories in the book that illustrate all of these reasons why teams change. Sometimes teams change because there's an effort to deliberately share knowledge amongst the team. And as well, there's also very human reasons why our teams might change. Maybe someone is working on a team today and they would prefer to switch teams so that they can work on a new topic or that they could work with different people. There's many human reasons why we might want to enable team change. And that doesn't come through, that human engagement level does not come through with the traditional wisdom on teams that insists that the best teams are stable or keep them the same. It just doesn't come through the forming, storming, norming, performing. What about the people? What about what the people want? I think that should be included. So how does this go down? How does this happen structurally? So from the data that I analyzed in a bottoms-up way, I came to 5 patterns of dynamic reteaming. And so the first pattern, I will explain each of these patterns now. The first pattern is the one-by-one pattern. We've been talking about that so far. Someone joins a team or someone leaves a team. This is the space of onboarding and offboarding people. The next pattern is grow and split, which we'll look at in a little while. Maybe your team grows bigger. It reaches a point where it feels like things are stagnating and we want to switch into 2 teams. So the team grows bigger and then you split it into 2 teams or more. The opposite of grow and split is the merging pattern. There are very good reasons why you might want to take smaller teams and merge them into a larger team or a larger community of teams. This comes into play. The isolation pattern is the 4th pattern, and that's when perhaps you are starting a new product and that 2-week cycle of existing teams on the left is too slow for the rate of learning that you need. And so you create a team off to the side and give this team process freedom to work differently, to work in shorter iterations, to catalyze that new product development that typically is at a different cadence than when you do product development on an existing or mature product. Isolation pattern. And the final pattern, again, is like the human reason. Sometimes people want to change. They want to switch to another team or maybe even another company. So let's dig into kind of the evolutionary aspect of teams. I like this model it's a metaphor that you can apply to a variety of things. This is from the book Panarchy by Gunderson and Halling. It's also referenced in the book Liberating Structures. In that wonderful community is where I learned about this. They apply it to work, but I'm going to explain this model and then I'm going to apply it to teams. So our teams evolve. So remember, you either catalyze changes or sometimes changes happen. We'll see that across time, our teams evolve. So to look into this metaphor, let's think about nature a bit. So the birth phase is when you're starting something. Maybe you're planting some seeds or acorns. If they take hold and they start to grow, they're in adolescence. If they don't grow, maybe they're in a poverty trap, kind of a failure to thrive, and they die off. That's what the poverty trap means on the side here. Let's say your tree grows and grows and grows. It becomes part of a forest. After a while, maybe it's stronger, but it could be that it hits a rigidity trap. Maybe that small spark causes a wildfire because the trees grew really thick, very thick canopy, and it was almost too much of a good thing, and it hits a rigidity trap or stagnation, and then it gets disrupted by a fire, and then we renew and we start again. Now, if we look at teams, slightly different graphic from my book, teams can be in the birth phase. Let's say it's a brand new team and it starts, and the team grows and grows and grows. You could also view this as a company growing larger. It could be that it gets very big. And unless you change the facilitation or the structure or the organization of your teams, things can break down. And so what is that change that will get you back into renewal, kind of out of this rigidity trap where things are taking longer, it's harder to make decisions, the work is unrelated, and maybe people are overloaded or burned out. So one shift could be like the grow and split pattern, splitting or changing the organizational composition so the teams start again. So back into this birth phase, and then they kind of continue on. I find this as a useful model to look at team development. And it happens at different levels. It could be that the person level, the base level, someone wants to switch to another team, and that's the change. It could be the team grows big and it splits. So it could be at the team level. It could be at the company level. Your company acquires another company and there's a blending that needs to happen with the organizational structures. So teams are going to change, and it can get a little bit confusing when a lot of this is going on, perhaps at different levels. You notice teams are splitting, someone's moving to a team, new people are joining, the company has acquired another company or gets acquired. All of these changes are part of the evolutionary nature of teams. But if you notice it happening, it could feel very confusing to you. It could also feel a bit triggering. I think when teams change, there could be a certain sense of loss. If people are forced to move from one team to the other and they're not in favor of it, you could have a big problem on your hands as a leader. It's always best to include people when you're working out changes that you catalyze. When people leave, it's another thing. It's not in your control necessarily. You can try to do things to prevent it, but kind of leaves this challenge amongst people. And I think, this quote is very true from the book Leadership on the Line. Like, people fear loss, and there is a lot of loss when teams change, but there are also gains. So, all right, well, what does all this mean? I just gave you a background on team change as a concept. It's an inevitable thing that's going to happen, so you might as well lean into it, strengthen and plan for it, as opposed to planning for stability, which is a bit less realistic. But let's bring this to 2022. And actually, what we're facing in 2022 has a little bit, or a lot of it, of something to do with what happened in early 2020 with COVID. People didn't necessarily see this coming, and the world changed in very unexpected ways. What we found since COVID started is that the world of work had shifted. Offices closed, and people were forced to work at home. Some with better setups than others, some with different challenges than others, but the world had to adapt to this. The world of high tech, the world of people working, I'm talking about software companies and other companies. There's other workers that were, at least in the US, we call essential workers, that were not able to work at home. And so there's a lot going on with that, but I'm focusing here on tech workers. So many of us found ourselves at home and we're connected using a screen sharing technology, and it's a completely different sort of experience. And so working in this way since 2020, then 2021 happened, there were a lot of other changes that kind of followed suit. The Great Resignation is a topic that you might have heard of. It's coined by a Dr. Anthony Klotz from Texas A&M University, talking about the mass departure of people from companies voluntarily when the pandemic happened. This is one of the aftershocks, I think, of these global changes related to COVID. People might have had pandemic epiphanies. People might have wanted to do something different, reflected on their lives, and have decided to pursue other opportunities. So the Great Resignation is one that's been very interesting, because in terms of team change and dynamic reteaming, leaders and team members are dealing with departures more frequently perhaps than before. So the switching pattern in dynamic reteaming terms is what comes to mind. Someone is choosing to move to another company or to change their life in some way. The switching pattern is the foremost pattern from dynamic reteaming terms. So Dr. Klotz talks about different reasons why people would be leaving. Some have what he terms pandemic epiphanies, where maybe someone decides that they don't want to work in software anymore. Instead, they want to open up a motorcycle shop where they're selling motorcycles and associated gear. That's a real story from someone that I know. Like, it's that time where we were all at home, the complete shift, looking at family. Some people have decided that their current job isn't enough for them. Some people have sought promotions they couldn't get at their company, or maybe even higher pay. There's a lot of articles you can read about that Great Resignation and people getting paid a lot more money because they're in short supply. So this is one of the kind of aftershocks that we've had to deal with. If you look at this graph, it's from layoffs.fyi, you'll notice a trend in companies tightening their funds and laying people off. So in the 2020s, there were a high degree of employees laid off at companies. It kind of settled a bit in 2021. Now Q2 2022, many of us have been following an uptick in layoffs, which is kind of interesting. But if you take a look at some other articles, like there's a great article here from TechCrunch about a Y Combinator letter that they emailed to their startup founders. You know, we've had COVID, we've had a war in Europe going on, we've had a very steep rise in interest rates. Things are happening, and startup founders are being advised to preserve funds, to make sure that you're using all of the people as efficiently as possible and cutting down on your expenses. So we're seeing that can you have a runway for a couple of years because you might not get the funding that you were getting as a private company before. It's harder to get that private funding for companies. So people are looking at how can you increase your runway, maybe get to profitability. And so maybe this has something to do with some of these layoff trends that we're seeing now in May 2022. So for us as leaders of companies and people that design and maintain and want our organizational structures to thrive, I like a metaphor of a tree. So strong trees can withstand the elements. They can withstand the strong wind, the rain, the snow, they have a strong trunk. And so how can we kind of use this metaphor and best prepare for the aftershocks that we might face? So we need to strengthen our companies and get ready for this, kind of like the strong tree. Like, how can we keep this in mind as we move forward? So I have 3 strategies to share with you about some of the things that I think about as a leader and, would love to talk with people about at this conference. So 3 strategies. So the first one, and the strategies I'm going to give relate to organizational structure and change and dynamic reteaming. So the first structure we'll take a look at is that merging pattern again, merging teams and what that means. Now, if you have a smaller team, like on the left here, some people in the software industry advocate having smaller teams. And it sure is easier for communication purposes if your teams are smaller. It can be easier to organize and get things done, definitely. But if you have 5 people leave your team and you're left with 2, it can be incredibly challenging. If you imagine if we have larger structures of teams and they work a little bit differently, and then you lose 5 people, maybe it's a little bit less challenging. You have different challenges. Everything is problem trading, right? So one of the things strategically that leaders might think about is how can we create larger communities of teams so that if people leave, for example, it might be a little, it might be a little easier to deal with. We at least, our structure will not completely collapse. So how can we merge teams together? I think it also helps to work in larger communities of teams, especially if you have a lot of specialists. Some people have front-end engineers, back-end engineers, and if they're spread across multiple small teams, and then you don't have enough, people will just want to hire or switch specialists, and it can be very taxing. But if you create communities of teams together and engage them to organize as they see fit to get their shared work done, you can have a bit more fluidity with your specialists. I think you can also have more shared ownership of work, because if you can imagine a larger structure comprised that can organize into smaller teams and reorganize, and you give them the freedom to do this, you probably want to have a shared list of work for the whole community, and then you can coach the teams to organize around that work. Now, I'm suggesting that we merge teams together, but this is no easy feat. It's definitely a challenge, like you're facing a very large wave. It's not so easy to just snap the teams into larger teams. It takes a lot of time. And I think if you intend to pursue something like this, to consider it, you need to really involve people in decision and plan it together with the engineers. This is a photo, and there's a story in my book related to this, of visualizing a change that was with about 80 people across. They were in one large team, and this group was splitting them into 3 divisions. So 3 communities of teams. They planned it with the engineers. They put the new team composition on the whiteboard, and they planned it to include the thoughts of the people doing the work. This is important because what they learned was that their original proposal of how the new teams could be organized was flawed in a couple respects, and they wound up altering and changing it based on the input of the people that are closest to the work. So I think a lot of the team changes, you'll have greater success if the people feel ownership. I think also you need to write out the plan. If you are going to be changing teams for whatever reason, let's say it's merging, you need to write out, I recommend writing out a document and working on that with people with what problem are you trying to solve. You can have a visual of what the team structure looks like before the change and after the change. What is the timeline of the change? And also frequently ask questions about the change. It's really, really challenging, depending on the size of your organization, to also get these plans across. I love this advice from Patrick Lencioni. He wrote the book, The Advantage, and some other really great books like 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. He talks about leaders need, or even CEOs needing to be chief reminding officers. You have to say your plan, like that team change plan I was talking about, at least 7 times. And I would add doing it in multiple communication channels, doing it through email, doing it through your online chat, doing it through your synchronous meetings, doing it through the all hands meetings, the one-on-one meetings. You need to over communicate the plans because it's very hard to get the ideas across. Another idea is that, well, another concept is that the leaders really need to have patience with the changes. You could be planning a change, getting it on the whiteboards, not even talking to the people yet. And since you've been talking about it for a month with your planning team, you might be ready to just get this thing over with, but you have to bring people along for the ride, and you need to have patience about any kind of change. So let's say you do that change and you have these larger teams together. One thing you could do is kick them off again or relaunch the larger teams. These are some books, including my book in the center, chapter 13 helps with this. The wonderful book, Creating Intelligent Teams, and Liftoff are 2 other resources that have activities that you can do with teams so they can realign on who the people are, the relationships between the people, what the personal preferences are, the work organization, the workflow. The code organization is another aspect to talk about when your teams merge or change in some way. So you want to relaunch your teams. If you go about merging, again, to have these more resilient structures to withstand aftershocks of other things going on in the world, you need to lean into facilitation because it's harder to organize when you have a large team of teams than a bunch of smaller teams. And these are a couple resources that I recommend about that. This Liberating Structures book has facilitation activities that can scale, as well as this great book by Sam Keener, The Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision-Making. So you need to lean into facilitation. And really, like, coaching needs to happen. Like, you can't just put the larger teams together and hope for the best. It takes kind of care and feeding to enable the teams and to coach them through how they might organize and reorganize based on the work at hand. Managers can do this, coaches can do this, but it does take care. It's hard. So the first idea of dealing with aftershocks and preparing our companies so we can be strong and resilient, like this metaphor of a tree, is to engage people to work together. So if you imagine you have only one person on a team or responsible for a system, and that person leaves, you're just left with a problem that's kind of hard to solve. Who's going to own that system? Maybe they give you 2 weeks notice, maybe not. And you have this problem as a leader of what's going to happen here, who are the stakeholders going to go to, who's going to maintain the system, who's going to carry on the work that was started. You have this sort of tower of knowledge. Richard Sheridan is a person that I interviewed in my book. He's the chief storyteller and co-founder of a company called Menlo Innovations in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And he talks about towers of knowledge. Now, before he started Menlo, he was talking about that instance where you'd have one, he was a VP of engineering, I believe, or CTO, and you have one person owning one system, and then they leave and you have this challenging problem. It's almost like the quality of life of the person, even when they're at the company, they might have to take their computer on vacation. This is an extreme example here, but like, imagine all that pressure to maintain a system, or it breaks down in production and you're the only one that knows about it. It's hard to work like that. So what we want to do, and this is the second strategy for dealing with aftershocks, is we wanted to build a culture where people work together and learn together. Now, they don't necessarily, this is pair programming as an example of like a buddy system. And at Menlo Innovations, this is a picture from Menlo, they work in pairs deliberately. So Richard had that experience at his previous company where there were a lot of these towers of knowledge and single points of failure, one person owning one system. And then when he started his company with his co-founder, it was such a visceral learning that even people that aren't programming are also working in pairs, and then they're switching pairs to transfer knowledge. So it's a structure that can help us kind of move and sway with the changes that might come our way. This is not unique to that company. It's also, this is a photo from Pivotal Cloud Foundry. I interviewed someone named Evan Wiley from that company, and he was telling me that they deliberately would try to share knowledge across the companies by having people change teams at a regular cadence and keep track how long an engineer was on one team. Oh, might they be up for a change? And we can spread knowledge as well as give people a sense of renewal. So working collaboratively, building relationships, you can do it with pairing, you can do it with ensemble programming or mob programming. The idea is that you have more shared ownership, less information leaves the building, so the structure is a bit more resilient. This is a photo here of a team working together on one piece of work together, learning and growing together. If someone or two people happen to leave, there's a bit more people around. Mob programming originated at a company called Hunter Industries. There's stories in my book about this company. And this is a picture of their setup. You can also do it with remote teams. It's not without its challenges. People don't necessarily understand, well, why would you have 5 people working on one thing? Or even with pair programming, why might you have 2 engineers working on one thing? Are you doing okay with how you're allocating your people? Shouldn't it be one person for one thing? And I find, and you know, there's also challenges because people don't necessarily want to work this way. So how can you cultivate an environment where you encourage collaboration? You give people the freedom to work together, work apart, work together, work apart, maybe opt into different structures. What I've found as I've tried to influence companies, I mean, and we're talking since probably 2007, I've been influencing engineers to pair and to work together. Some of the things that you can do is like a book club. I was at one company and the people that were enthusiasts on pair programming would have a book club and invite others to be interested in those that were interested in reading the book could meet together and they could talk about how to do this. There's certain practices that you can do with pairing, as well as with mob programming. Another way to influence people, Woody Zuhl is one of the founders of mob programming, was at Hunter Industries, which we talked about before. I invited Woody to give a talk at our meetup group, at our local company, and just getting influenced by an expert helps as well. So those are some tactical ideas. So the third strategy that I have for you for dealing with aftershocks when we're subject to different events, such as people leaving companies, is to really index on the relationship building. So we talked about teams merging together to have larger communities of people. We talked about working together to build in more redundancy, like with pairing, for example. And now let's talk about the quality of life in the team, the relationships, the people together. I was at a company as a consultant. I did have a consulting stint after I was at the second startup. And I was with a couple of engineers and we were talking about something together, and all of a sudden they both had their video off. You could see mine was on, and all of a sudden you could hear barking in the background. And I was like, oh, you have a dog. Can you show me your dog? And the gentleman that was in the center video lifted up this Pomeranian, and the person on the right side of the video was like, oh my gosh, I have a Pomeranian too. And then he lifted up his dog. And the thing is, these gentlemen had worked together for 7 years. And they never knew that they each had the same breed of dog, which is not the most common dog, at least around, we were in California, all in California. Like, it's not the most common dog that you see every day. That would be the Labradoodle probably these days, but they didn't know each other that well. And I found it to be very striking. You know, it's almost like, okay, so do you want the video on all the time? Well, not necessarily. We turn our videos on and off, but how can we get to a level of knowing each other that's a little bit more than always talking about work? The other thing for relationship building, like these two people here are having a conversation, and the gentleman on the right is working at the same time they're having the conversation. And imagine if instead they were really paying attention to each other. And I think it's like putting our attention out, having face-to-face contact, even through Zoom or through online screen, you know, mediated communication, not multitasking, and really trying to like intentionally focus on another person is something everyone needs to shift into. How can we really pay attention to people so they feel heard? It improves the quality of our interactions. I think also equalizing the local and remote. This is a photo here you can see in the screen sharing in the upper left. This one's using GoToMeeting, it looks like. There's a team that's having a stand-up meeting, and then the team members that are in other locations are in the screen. And this is a hybrid setup. There's always communication challenges. You can't hear or see people. Looks like there's someone with a red shirt in the upper left corner there. You can't even see that person. Can you hear them? Equalizing the local and remote and trying to foster greater collaboration. You know, the go-to usually for this is everybody is one person, one screen. So at least the playing field is leveled a bit. The other thing you can do for this relationship building to strengthen your team so they can withstand change is focusing on your managers. So if you have software engineers, they have managers, then there's directors, and there's like VP layer, right? But really focusing on that manager development so that they pay attention to people, they have their one-on-ones, they focus on career paths, manager training, and really strategically improving the quality of the management approach is recommended. These are a couple of books that I really like. This one, It's the Manager. It's from the Gallup organization. Really has a lot of great ideas tied to engagement and how can we bring people along their career paths using a strengths-based approach where you amplify what people are good at or their natural talents to try to develop them into strengths. And the other book I really like is The Leader Lab. And this is written by the folks at Life Labs Learning. And they have great training that's delivered online that's quite affordable as well for companies. This is a skill-based book about how to give people feedback, how to have effective one-on-ones. They talk about a variety of communication tactics as well. The other thing you can do is engage people at the team level to build relationships, or in that community of teams. People can write users guides to themselves and share some key information that they want their teammates to know about them. You know, what they struggle with, what their communication preferences are. Everybody could have a user guide and share it. I didn't make this up. If you Google user guide to me, you'll find a lot of different approaches to this, but it's a team activity that you can do together. As well as this one, this one's from Organizational Relationship Systems Coaching, ORSC, designing your team alliance. When the team gets together or gets a new member or loses a member, they can realign on what they want their team to be like. This is from a coach, Paul Tevis, the person that was standing on the table. He would do this a lot with teams. What atmosphere do we want to create on this team? What will it help us flourish? How do we want to be together when things get difficult? Because they will. Working out conflict protocols and normalizing conflict is something you can do in teams, and it helps build stronger relationships. This book, Creating Intelligent Teams, also written by one of the co-founders of CRR Global. I'm trained in their coaching approach where you coach people, coach teams as systems. They have an activity in this book that is amazing. It's called Lance Work. And this is a photo of, it scales to a larger group that this was from one of the companies I worked with. We did an on-site in a warehouse. And with Lance Work, it's an activity with movement. So it's good when you get your teams together for an in-person event, for example. And people, it's a role empathy exercise where maybe on teams you have certain roles, like in the picture on the left, engineers, quality assurance, user experience, product management, product marketing. Everyone has a different vantage point to the work that's going to be done and might have different challenges and might offer up ways to help each other. So it's a very interactive activity where you stand in the land of your colleagues and other roles, and you talk about how you will help them succeed or acknowledge the challenges that they face. Another awesome activity that I really, really love, I write about in my book, called The Story of Our Team. So this is another activity where you get your team together and they make a timeline of what's happened in the past up until today. People write, like on this example, they would write on the paper that's attached to the windows there. So they would write about, this is when I joined the company. This is when people left. This is when we released key pieces of our software. And they talk about the highs and lows. And after they make this shared artifact, they tell the story of the team and then you videotape it. So starting at the very left were the early team members, and then you videotape them telling the story of what they wrote on the timeline. It's a very powerful activity and it scales. I've done it with 60, I think, user experience folks at one point, where you could do it at a smaller team, and it helps people get a sense of shared history, which is important when you're dealing with people joining, people leaving. Finding shared causes via open space is another idea. Harrison Owen wrote a book about open space technology. You can have an internal conference at your company where the people are engaged to solve a problem faced by the organization. They come up with a conference schedule, and the people across the different teams find each other and maybe create guilds to work after the conference. So this builds relationships. You could do it if you merge teams and have that larger community. They could have an open space within that community. I've seen like 25 to 30 people in these communities, and when they kind of break off and they work together. So really cultivating the relationships in those communities is the key. Okay, so I've talked about 3 strategies to help us better deal with the aftershocks of change so we can be stronger in our companies and our organizations, kind of like these trees. They withstand the elements. Merging teams is the first strategy. Working together, let's say by pairing, ensemble is another approach. Deliberately spreading information and building relationships amongst the people in the teams. These are some strategies to withstand the changes, because we're either going to catalyze the changes or we're going to get surprised by them. And, you know, again, sometimes things evolve and we have to deal with things. We're not doing it wrong when our teams change. You know, at the beginning of this, we looked at the wisdom says, keep your teams stable, keep your teams the same. It's almost like, what a luxury if we could just control everything and, like, you know, have that quest for stability. I guess I'm more of a realist, being a practitioner in the trenches. I work in a software company. We need to be prepared and be able to kind of move and sway with the changes like a tree, because we're going to get curveballs. We're going to get the shock of the arc of the ball, and we're going to have to, we don't want to crumble. We want to come through and be successful. And we can do it. Like, you can make a big impact in your company by initiating some positive movement to making your team stronger, so you can be strong like these trees. So, and it's all about the ride. So focusing on the quality of the relationships with the people is always first and foremost. So thank you so much. I'm Heidi Helfand. You can feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I look forward to hearing the questions that you have, and have a wonderful day.